Hey, it's Dr. Mike Nelson here, back again. Today we're talking about bioenergetic BS. What is a new model for how your body creates energy to fuel exercise and movement? I didn't even bother to put the chart in here, but I'm sure you've all seen it. You've got your ATP PC system is, 1 to 10 seconds. And then they start listing everything down through here. Eventually you get to the use of fat. And that's somewhere between 3 to 5 minutes or greater. And they walk you through all the different intermediate systems. And the common held belief is we could divide these into what's called anaerobic exercise and aerobic exercise. I'm sure you've all seen this already. And that's a little bit of an oversimplification, but anaerobic, not using oxygen. Aerobic is using oxygen. Right? And classically, anaerobic is all carbohydrates. And this one could be carbs, right? You can run carbs aerobically, or could be fat. And what we find out and what we've learned, I would say, maybe this will be changed in the future, but I would say unlikely not. There really is not any anaerobic exercise, which I know drives people crazy. All exercise is aerobic to some degree, but varying degrees of that. You can't really find any exercise that does not use oxygen in some capacity. Therefore, anaerobic exercise does not exist. Now again, before people lose their mind here, this doesn't mean that the training systems that you've been using don't work, right? If you did X training and you got Y result, obviously it did something, right? It obviously worked. We're saying we're going to look inside the black box and see what's going on. All right, I like using the black box analogy. So we put stuff in, right? This may be your training program, your nutrition, recovery. Here's the human body and physiology. And then here is your output. So what did you get out? Are they bigger, stronger, faster, leaner, etc.? Your training system, what you had them do and what they saw as a result could very well work without knowing almost anything in here. The only reason to look inside the black box is to change our inputs. So why things work is useful at some point. Now again, if you are a researcher, you may spend your entire career looking inside the black box and do lots of cool mechanistic stuff. You don't really care about what goes in and what goes out. Right? That's not your job. Your job is to figure out how these little widgets do things. If you are a coach, a trainer of any form, then you care a lot about what goes in and what goes out, because that's what you're paid on. And understanding why will allow us then to get back to a better input. So I am completely guilty of using the old model and even have it published in magazines from a couple of years ago. I've talked about it in lectures. How I changed my mind is about, maybe it was 5 or 6 years ago, maybe longer than that. I saw Roger from the company Moxie present at the Design of Medical Devices conference at the University of Minnesota. And he had this cool device where you could put a device on a muscle and you could get information from it. And this is something called NIRS technology. You're probably familiar with that with finger O2 sensors. Everybody's seen these in the hospital. You stick the little sensor on the end of your finger, and it tells you percentage of oxygen. What that is that's looking at arterial. How well can you load oxygen onto hemoglobin on the arterial side? And most of the time, we want to be very high, right? 97, 98%, somewhere around there. This is very useful in a hospital setting because if your O2 stats start dropping, that's a really good indicator, something's going on. Now for most athletes, unless you're really, really pushing it, this will stay relatively constant-ish. Now again, that's a little bit debatable. There may be are cases where you can see it drop. With MOXIE, it is the same idea, or NIRS, near-infrared spectroscopy, but they put into a device that you now stick on the muscle. What this does is it shoots a little beam of light into the muscle, and then this gets reflected back off into another sensor. And from that, they get data, or something called SmO2. How much oxygen is being saturated on these little hemoglobin guys, myoglobin also, as they float by the sensor. We can also get a proxy measure for blood flow. Again, that is approximate. There's some debate about how accurate that is, but per exercise session, we can see changes in blood flow. This is more of a delta. How this is useful then, and what blew my mind, is a few years later, I think it was Aaron Davis at Evolve, stuck a MOXIE sensor on a quad. So usually they'll put it on what's called the VL, or the outer quad muscle, vastus lateralis. And they had an athlete go and do a 30-second all-out sprint. And you could watch on the screen the percentage of oxygen. And since I have a full MOXIE set up here, I did the same thing to myself probably a year and a half ago. Now, what you think is 30 seconds all out, when I did it, I used a rower. You can use a bike. Doesn't matter as long as it's a full body type movement. In the lab, we used to do what's called the Wingate testing all the time. So high output of wattage, 20 to 30 seconds, like balls out. It's usually made people puke in the bathroom too. So not a lot of fun if you haven't done it before. But, so I stuck the MOXIE on my quad. I got a reading. So it started out at, I think I was at 81%. Again, this one number won't necessarily be 100 all the time, but it should be relatively high. So no work being done. My, we'll say muscle, for keeping it simple, is saturated with about 81% oxygen. And just sitting there, it would hang out around 80 to 81%. So I start rowing as hard as I can. At the end of 30 seconds, what you saw was, I think I hit, maybe 15 to 18%. I desaturated, I used oxygen, right, because it started off at 81% in the muscle. By the end, I was definitely less than 20%. However, classically, this 30-second output is considered kind of an anaerobic event. I shouldn't really be using a lot of oxygen for it. And it turns out I was. And when I first saw that again, I think it was through Aaron, that really screwed me up for many years. So I was like, wait a minute, like how does this fit with the old model where we're supposed to have this anaerobic exercise that, yeah, maybe we're using some oxygen at the end of this 30 seconds, but that's supposed to be an anaerobic, you have alactic, all these other terms, and what you find is they don't really exist. If you simplify everything, what you find is all exercise is aerobic. All exercise actually is using the lactate to a high degree too. You're like, whoa, wait a minute, lactate? I thought that was lactic acid, and that's like really bad. So it turns out lactic acid immediately turns into lactate. And I've done other lectures on this too. And these pesky hydrogen ions. So if you do, we'll just say high output work, you're producing lactate and hydrogen ions. Now it is true when you do this, right? If you've ever done leg extensions for a lot in a row, you feel a burning sensation, and at some point you just can't do any more reps. People say, oh, it's the lactic acid burn. Well, it's actually lactate being produced, which is a fuel, but when you're producing lactate, you're almost always producing more of these hydrogen ions. Hydrogen ions are literally an acid. So you're literally dumping acid into the muscle, which then bugs the neurons there, the nerves, and causes a burning sensation. It's the hydrogen ions that are producing the acid that are the issue. Turns out lactate is used as a fuel. So lactate can then be used by other muscles, more of the non-primary or non-working muscle. The brain loves lactate. Cardiac system loves lactate. And you can even have a little bit of that recycled from the liver via something called the Cori cycle. Now, the downside with that is it does take a little bit more time. The takeaway here is that high intensity work does result in kind of this burning sensation, and that is sort of from lactic acid, although lactic acid doesn't really exist very long, and disassociates immediately into lactate, which is used as a fuel. It's actually a really good fuel. It's a very high energy fuel. You can create a fair amount of ATP at a fast rate from it. The downside is when your body produces this via bioenergetics, you do produce a lot of hydrogen ions at the same time, which causes burning, and this eventually can interfere with the actin and myosin cross-bridging and decreases muscle output. All of that to say that if we back up, what we're talking about here is related to bioenergetics. All of the work is primarily aerobic. So we're using oxygen to run all of this, and the lactate is actually used all the time, just at different rates. So you watching this fun little lecture here, you actually are running lactate at rest. Not a lot, but you are still using it. So again, my whole reason for pointing out this video is that anaerobic exercise doesn't really exist. We can think of that as all rates of oxygen use. And in my example of an all-out 30-second wind gate, we're dropping oxygen use very fast and very hard within 30 seconds. If we did something more moderate, so lower intensity work, so example, I did this the other day. I just got on the rower and did a moderate pace, and after a minute or two, my SMO2 was around 40%, right? So I didn't get super low. I didn't strip all the oxygen off it. I stripped off about half. Right, so it's better to think of oxygen use and rate than the old anaerobic. My other word I hate is alactic. Right, nothing is alactic. We're always using lactate. To different degrees, yes. So it is true that if you do higher intensity work, right, you've seen the old lactate monitors, that we do produce more lactate. And the reason we did lactate monitoring was we were trying to really use it as a proxy for hydrogen ions. But hydrogen ions are really, really hard to measure. We knew that lactate was produced at the same rate of hydrogen ions. So with lactate testing, we were really trying to get to what is the hydrogen ions that are produced. And that gets even more confusing because your body, of course, will buffer some of those hydrogen ions so you can do greater amounts of work. So my whole point of this video is that we want to rethink why some stuff works so we can get a better input that is more accurate, thus resulting in a better output. Part of that is based on our current understanding of these molecular models. A better input results in a better output. How do you get a better input? Then it's worth discussing and looking at why things are going on, at least to the best of our knowledge right now. So we have direct evidence that oxygen is being used even in something like a wind gate or a classic anaerobic type event. And lactate is also being used to a much higher degree than what most people realize. And this kind of changes our thought of fuels. Yep, fat is still used, carbohydrates are still used. You know, those parts are generally still true. It's not that we don't use those fuels. It's that oxygen is used all the time at different rates, and lactate is not a bad thing. It's actually a really great fuel. It's thinking more about how do we buffer and work with some of the hydrogen ions that are accumulating, more so than trying to not necessarily use lactate as a fuel. So if you want more information on this, there's some good references. A good place to start is something called the glycogen shunt theory. If you just look up glycogen shunt theory in the old PubMed, it'll pop up and has lots of great references there. Near spectroscopy is good. You can look up MOXIE is a system that I use for that, and I don't have any disclosures with them. So, thank you very much. Take care.